I'm Jane Wald, the Emily Dickinson Museum's Executive Director, and I'm coming to you live from Emily Dickinson's colorful and cozy parlor on this 194th anniversary of her birth. I see quite a number of you have joined us already, and we want to know where you're coming from. Let us know in the chat. It's always fun to be able to greet people from around the country and around the globe. And so let's see. I see we've got folks from Los Angeles, Connecticut, Ohio, Mexico, um, Spain, right up the road in Salem, right across the state in Salem, New York City, Wisconsin. Oh, and our friends from Argentina and Brazil are here also. Well, this is great. It's wonderful, wonderful to see, have you all here with us on Emily Dickinson's birthday. Um, we're adding a little challenge to the birthday this year by aiming for 194 gifts celebrating Emily Dickinson by the end of the evening. So you know where to go to make your gift. It's at emilydickinsonmuseum.org. And I think we are within 30-ish gifts of making our goal. So perhaps sometime in the next hour, you'll help us get to the finish line. Well, today we're bringing you a glimpse behind the scenes into a project that is a first for the Emily Dickinson Museum, the construction of a new building. So obviously for the last 20 years, we've been focusing on our historic buildings, our old buildings. But this one is not just any building, and it's not just any construction. And we'll hear more about that as we go along this evening. So if you've been following along for the last little while, you'll have heard us talk about completing some significant work at the Evergreens. We've completed all the major infrastructure and systems and exterior restoration work necessary at this point. So we're going inside to begin the painstaking process of stabilizing delicate 19th century plaster and the original wallpapers. We'll give you a bit of a behind the scenes look at that process next year when we're a little further along. Now, at the homestead, we have one more phase of restoration to go, this time focusing on spaces that were scenes of domestic labor. The kitchen, the laundry, the rooms for hired help at the back of the house. And all of this so that we can better represent themes of class, ethnicity, race, and gender in Emily Dickinson's world. But to be able to get to that third and final phase of restoration, we need to relocate some of the functions that currently reside in the homestead. So our tour center and museum shop and some administrative spaces, and they need to go elsewhere. So here's where we reach back into the history of the property. During Emily Dickinson's lifetime, there were several outbuildings on the property. We don't know much about the locations of an old cider house or a summer house that was down in the garden, but we do know the approximate locations and the general appearance of the homestead barn and the Evergreens carriage house. And you'll hear more about how we know what we know in a few minutes. But reinstating these two historic structures fulfills two purposes. First is it is interpretive, and the second is just very practical. And this emerges from our master plan created way back in 2006. And the preservation architect, Jeff Baker, said in that plan that the Dickinson site cannot be completely understood from a functional or aesthetic perspective without the eventual reconstruction of the homestead barn and the Evergreens carriage house. The size and position of these two structures were simply too significant to ignore. And the story of how the family lived on this site will be considerably reinforced by their return. If we assume that these outbuildings are to be eventually reconstructed, it makes perfect sense to consider them to house the facilities needed by the museum. So this was a pretty good flag for us in these last 20 years to understand that the reinstatement of those two buildings was needed to be a goal. And yes, the rationale does make perfect sense. And now is the time that we need those facilities. So the carriage house our focus for this evening, will first serve as our visitor welcome center and museum shop, while also giving us some workspace for museum staff. One way to think about it is that it's an enabling project that will clear the way for the final phase of homestead restoration. So that's the background. And now to bring us up to speed on where we are now, we've invited 4 special guests who are involved in this project to give us some insights from their perspectives of archaeology, historic preservation, capital project management, and passive house architecture and engineering. So I'll spend a few minutes chatting with each, then we'll welcome your questions in the Q&A. But while our program is underway this evening, feel free to continue chatting in the chat. And if you have a question for any of our guests, just please pop those into the Q&A feature instead of the chat. So our first guest is Suanna Crowley, a lead archaeologist and geoarchaeologist with SWCA Environmental Consultants in Amherst. Suanna specializes in research focused on the interaction of human groups with their environments, particularly at sensitive or complex sites across North America. However, over her career, she's managed research projects in the Indus River and Tigris-Euphrates valleys, and has served as an appointee to the Massachusetts Historical Commission Review Board. She's got a nickname. She's also known as Dr. Dirt, and she is passionate about science communication and making both data and discoveries more engaging for public audiences. So welcome, Suanna. And just one little bit more of preliminary for our viewers, let me set just a little bit of a scene for your arrival and the arrival of your team at the Carriage House site. And that is because the homestead and the Evergreens are totally preserved properties and operate under a preservation restriction held by the Massachusetts Historical Commission. We need to have all major modifications to the site and the buildings approved by the commission. And when there will be disruption of the landscape, the commission may wish to require an archaeological survey or excavation. In the case of this Carriage House project, the commission did not require archaeology, but the museum, we just didn't want to lose any valuable information about the site or the lives of the Dickinsons by skipping that step. So with that bit of context, Suanna, let me ask, tell us what you and your team did on site here at the museum when you first became involved in this project.
Absolutely, Jane. Thank you so much for the very warm welcome. And thank you for the thoughtfulness and care that you and the museum staff are putting into steps like this to be part of the best practice of preservation, and certainly with archaeology at your back, helping with the questions of preservation and interpretation at the site. So my team of archaeologists came on board to conduct archaeological monitoring. And if I may, I have some slides to share. Would that be all right?
Please, yeah, please, let's see them.
Very good. Well, my team came on board over this last part of the year to really engage in archaeological monitoring. And monitoring is one of those best practices that supports organizations with large-scale construction projects where we know there's ground disturbance in the past. This isn't the archaeology of a National Geographic special. We're not doing trowels and brushes on our hands and knees. This is archaeology in hard hats and steel-toed boots and standing in front of major pieces of equipment, heavy equipment, which is doing a lot of earth moving. In this case, we're really looking at preservation that may have taken place in contexts that are not pristine. So we are able to recover data and look at objects to understand a little bit more about the occupants of the house or groups of people over time. So some of the things that we were able to recover and uncover during our time monitoring at the archaeological site really kind of fall into two categories. And those categories are personal or domestic items, and then also some architectural remains. And here you can see some of the variety of objects that were removed and recovered from the footprint of the carriage house building. The very large slide in the middle is an assortment of whitewares, and other kinds of ceramics, mostly plates and cups and bowls in very fragmentary condition. We also have examples of metalwork, pieces of metal. You can see something that looks like a spring, other pieces of iron. We also have a great deal of glass that was coming from the area where mechanical excavation was taking place. In this case, a large number of bottles, some of them for vessels like medicines and others for drinking.
Yeah, Suanna, I think it's just so interesting, the types of objects that you pulled out of the ground. And, we had an inkling, I think, that there were such artifacts remaining from from another kind of archaeological survey done years and years ago, where there just wasn't really just wasn't time to look at what was in the ground. So that's that's one important reason that we wanted you all to come and you know uh, spend a little time with the things we just we knew might be there but just didn't know what they were, um, and so it's quite a range of material.
Absolutely, there really is. And archaeology does have a long history at the museum, a special place in the interpretation and preservation planning for the museum. In this case, there was some archaeology done by the University of Massachusetts at Amherst that had hinted at a deposit in the footprint of the former carriage house. And so we had a little bit of a preview about what might be contained within the deposits there in the footprint of the building. In this case, we are really able to distinguish three separate episodes of fill that were placed there, probably just as part of a discard process from occupants living at the house. But in this case, we were able to really see some excellent preservation going back into the 1830s and 1840s of different kinds of objects. And certainly glass is among the most fragile kind of object that can be found in an archaeological site. But here we were really able to recover some beautiful examples of different kinds of glassware and glass vessels.
That's really yeah, that there some of those things are just so intact.
That center one
Remarkable.
is a coupe glass. It would have been something that was used during holiday times or festive occasions, and had something special to sip with in an evening or at another event. And the other vessels, cobalt blue glass medicine bottle, a little bit later in time, but certainly something that could have been deposited as part of regular household use. And then an amber bottle, probably something for beer or another liquid. Again, a little bit later in time.
So the coupe glass kind of catches my eye because, as many of you in our audience may know, Martha Dickinson Bianchi, Austin and Susan's daughter, was an author in her own right, and she penned, I think it was 8 novels. And one summer I read them all, and in one of them she mentioned um, the kind of champagne she wanted her characters to be drinking, and I just assumed that that was her favorite champagne also. And so, if you need to know, it's Vieux Clicquot.
Excellent. That would be my favorite too. Well, it's good to be able to see some of those artifacts, those objects, we call them material culture, that reflect the life ways of the occupants of the house, the patterns of the people who are living there, social status, social experiences, all kind of preserved in the archaeological record. But I do have one other fantastic object to share,
Let's
and that
that's
is
right.
what we believe to be an inkwell. And this inkwell is a glass object. It has no pontil, no maker's mark on the bottom. So we're not entirely sure if it was blown into a mold or free blown as an object. It certainly looks quite well shaped and symmetric. But from about 1860 to 1920. And archaeologists often have objects with this kind of a range of time frames because we're not always able to tell with specificity. We have great records that tell us that these objects were manufactured between X year and Y year. And so we don't have clear indication that this belonged to an individual, but certainly the tantalizing possibility of an inkwell being discovered in the archaeological recovery process during monitoring is something I think quite distinct and quite special.
Yeah, that really is special because, I just mentioned that Martha Dickinson Bianchi herself was a writer. Her aunt, one of the greatest poets in all of literature, and so it was a family that was really devoted to this kind of creativity, and also had a couple of, attorneys, businessmen among them who also produced a lot of written material. Um, so I thought that might be an object you would want to show to us. And because these objects have been returned to the museum, I'll just give our friends at home sort of a view in real time uh, of this inkwell.
It's
It
quite a
has
substantial object too, isn't it?
it's quite heavy. Yeah, yeah. And um, well, I'm kind of curious about it has four receptacles for writing instruments on the top, and there's one that has a ridge. You might be able to see it in profile a little better. One of them has a ridge around the top, and the other three don't, but perhaps they did have. So that's a curious little feature I'd like to learn more about.
Indeed, indeed. And it's really remarkable to be able to connect an object to kind of the family business of the people who are living at the property and be able to talk a little bit more about both its meaning to those individuals and its meaning as an independent object, its manufacture, its place of origin, something that we can do a little bit more research on.
Yeah. So you have another little grouping. There's the sort of the indoor domestic stuff, and then there's the architectural kinds of objects.
Indeed, we did find that second category of object that we're really thinking of as architectural remains. And highlighting here just a couple of the distinctive objects that we were able to recover. On the left side of the screen is something we're identifying as a terracotta dog's paw. There's no specific date associated with it, and we don't have the remains of what must have been a much larger object or vessel, certainly something very distinctly made. It has a great deal of texture. You could tell what it was immediately upon recovering it from the soil. But the balance of the object, we don't have much of an idea of yet, something that will again take a little bit more research. But as something that catches the eye, it is very distinctive.
That's
On the
great.
other side of the screen, we're showing some pieces of very flat glass. This is a distinctive etched pattern of frosted glass. There's no specific date again to this object. We don't have a maker's mark or other sort of reference material, catalog, or other kind of documentary material to specifically date the glass in the pattern. But we do know that similar types of flat glass are seen on the property in the homestead and in the Evergreens. And the analog that we have there is really from glass windows inset into doors, if I'm not mistaken.
Exactly. Yes. At the most obvious, the front door of the homestead and the front door of the Evergreens have some very nice etched glass, but curiously, not this pattern.
Not this pattern, but what a wonderful object to be able to find and recover
Yeah.
again. So fragile. We found 26, 27, 28 different pieces of this pattern. Certainly something that could possibly be refit to see what kind of object or placement it may have had at an earlier point in time. Just clicking ahead, I want to also show off something related to the doors that we just mentioned, and that was the discovery of portion of a door with an intact doorknob on it. And on the left-hand side of the screen is that in situ object. The portion of the door, there is a little bit of the wood frame left, along with the hardware. And on the right, Jane, you had shared another analog from the house, which shows a similar brass or bronze, very decorative, highly ornate kind of a doorknob, and something that's very distinct. And you had told me a little bit of a story about the disposal of some doors.
Yeah. Um, so on the first floor of the Evergreens, all of the doors to the public spaces were taken off the hinges at some point, and it appears that they were replaced by portieres, by curtains hanging from rods above the door frame. We don't know exactly why, perhaps a fashion or aesthetic choice. Um, but where did those doors go? We always wanted them to be in the basement, but they just weren't in the basement. But finding this hardware and the wood fragments in the carriage house site, that just tells us, I think, that the Dickinsons, like anybody else, just took their disused objects and stored them in the garage until they could find something else to do with them. Uh, so yeah, um, this is really fascinating.
And I think it
This
speaks to kind of
hardware.
absolutely a common question that we have as homeowners when we take care of our property. What do we do with the objects we don't want? Sometimes they are discarded and forgotten. In this case, this door, as well as maybe two other sets of doorknobs or door hardware, were recovered from the footprint of the carriage house. I think the last object I wanted to just really show you is associated with a feature, probably of the earlier construction of the carriage house, and that is a set of pavers. Something to highlight as what we found in situ, in place. The image on the left-hand side of the screen is really showing an alignment of those pavers as they proceed from the carriage house footprint toward the main house. And the right-hand side is a little bit more up close of those. We were able to identify these. Certainly the earlier UMass Amherst archaeological team had identified a portion of them, but this archaeological monitoring process and the mechanical excavation really exposed a great deal more of them. There were 7 in total. And their alignment and their preservation is certainly something interesting to note and to think about as we, again, start to discuss the larger part of the project, which was the reconstruction of the carriage house itself. So I wanted to highlight this as a great jumping off point for my fellow guests on the panel tonight.
Oh, that's terrific. Thanks so much, Suanna. So please, you're going to stick around because we're going to get into some discussion or other questions and answers a little bit later. Now, before speaking with our next guest, uh, we want to share a brief birthday message from Dan Smith, who is the lead singer of the internationally celebrated band Bastille. Their album Ampersand just came out in October, and it included a song about Emily Dickinson. Here's Dan Smith.
Hello, I'm Dan, and I just wanted to wish a very happy birthday to the incredible, totally inimitable wordsmith, Emily Dickinson. For those of us who know and love her and her work, we are immeasurably luckier for having her in our lives. And I recently wrote a song called Emily and Her Penthouse in the Sky, which is my tribute and love letter to her amazing imagination and her relationship with her own creativity. So happy birthday, Emily Dickinson, and hello to all fellow Dickinson fans. I'm going to read one of her poems very badly, but my friend is obsessed with this poem, so this is for Soph. Exaltation is the going of an inland soul to sea, past the houses, past the headlands, into deep eternity. Bred as we are among the mountains, can the sailor understand the divine intoxication of the first league out from land? There you go. Happy birthday, Emily Dickinson.
That's super. Thanks to Dan Smith and Bastille. So joining us now is Shanti Onderhagen, who has over 30 years of experience in cultural resource protection. She's held staff and leadership positions in nonprofit organizations such as Historic New England, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and the Newport Restoration Foundation. And she served on numerous boards and commissions focused on historic preservation, cultural resources, architectural history, and local history. So Shanti's now a cultural resource consultant with expertise in historic preservation project management, which is what she helps us with, as well as the use of preservation and conservation easements to protect historic properties. So welcome, Shanti. Thanks for being here this evening.
Thank you. Thank you.
You have worked with the Emily Dickinson Museum on various projects, starting with our pandemic era homestead restoration. So that's a few years now. So this carriage house project, what, how is it different from the other kinds of work you've done on this site or elsewhere?
What's really interesting about the Carriage House project is, for one thing, it's very rare to have a new building put on a historic site. This is a reconstruction of a known building, but it is new construction. And what is especially exciting about this reconstruction is it is not an exact replica. It is somewhat of an interpretation, but within the guidelines and standards that preservation works. And you'll hear more about the approach that was selected, which is a passive house approach, a sustainable building, modern construction that will, to a great extent, replicate the appearance of the historic building.
So you mentioned standards just a moment ago, and you know, as an historic site, we observe what may be a mystery to people outside this biz, and that those are the Secretary of the Interior's standards for treatment of historic properties. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what they are and why do they matter, and what, if anything, do they have to do with this carriage house project?
So sure. Well, beginning in 1966, with the passage of the National Historic Preservation Act, the federal government began crafting guidance on how to appropriately approach and undertake projects at historic buildings. And the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties, it's a mouthful, were then established and are maintained by the National Park Service. And they are, in fact, contained in the Code of Federal Regulations. There are 4 treatments that one can choose from when approaching work at within a historic context: preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, and reconstruction. And the choice of treatment is primarily dependent on a property's significance, on physical condition, on the amount of documentation that may be available, on a proposed use, and code and other regulations. So for the Carriage House project, the choice of treatment was pretty obvious. The building no longer existed, so we chose reconstruction. And, you know, basically what the standards ensure is that there's a consistent and justifiable context or approach to problem solving and projects that involve historic resources, that, you know, all of us involved in historic preservation are applying the same standards and using the same guidelines.
That's great. Yeah. So all right, so taking those standards and thinking about this reconstruction, there is the phase that's, you know, perhaps to me at least, the most fun of any of these projects, of all of these projects, and that's the hunt. You know, it's the research that has to be done to achieve as much authenticity as possible in a case of restoration, and credibility in the case of reconstruction. And I wonder if you could share with us just some of the steps that we
Sure.
went through to
Sure. Well,
arrive where we did.
I'll screen share in a second, but first and foremost, what you hope you have is some physical evidence left. Something that starts to lead you to understand what existed in the past that is now mostly gone. And if there's nothing above ground, which in this case there was not, there may well be something below ground. And ergo, as Suana has already explained, we had some archaeology done in the past that led us to understand, revealed the likely location and size, that is footprint, or dimensions on the ground of the original carriage house. I'm going to share my screen now and show you a couple of other things that were discovered. And for those who are interested, there is the book, the Bible for those of us in preservation, the Secretary of the Interior Standards. But we actually did have some archival documentation that was found in the process. Some the museum had on hand, but also some found as this project was being planned. Drawings, plans, photographs, maps, atlases, correspondence are all critical to understanding what may have existed at a property. And so for the carriage house, here are some of the things that that helped us understand what the previously existing building looked like. This is an 1870 or 80 photograph called the Prouty view. You can see it's a winter view with the Evergreens to the left and the carriage house to the right. So what this helped us understand was the size in relationship to the extant Evergreens. We knew it was 1.5 stories. We knew it was gable end. This is another view, 1875. And again, you can see sort of in the lower middle of this left-hand photograph, the Evergreens, and again, to the right where the red arrow is pointing downward, the carriage house. So it confirms, and these are only probably 5 or 10 years apart, the previous image. And you can see on the right, zooming in a little bit, albeit fuzzily, that we start to see that perhaps there were openings in a particular area and the roof was a particular angle. Then we have a bird's eye view that gave us further information. These are often sketches. There is a bit of artistic license with bird's eye views, so you have to be a little bit careful. But again, we see the Evergreens to the left and the carriage barn to the right. The artist has helpfully told us that there was probably an entrance right on that facade facing the street. And then finally, a 1910 Sanborn Fire insurance map. Those of you who work with historic properties know all about these wonderful resources that tell us from the late 19th century well into the mid 20th century what communities' buildings were like. The colors tell us the materials. You often know what the roof line looks like. They tell you the number of stories. They tell you the use. And so up in the upper left corner of plate 11 of the 1910 Sanborn Fire Insurance Map, you see the detail on the right. We learn that there's a carriage house that is storage. There's a storage building next to the Evergreens. We know it's 2 stories, interestingly. We know it's wood framed because it's yellow. So there's lots of information that can be garnered from even just 4 or 5 archival resources.
Yeah, 2 years ago we didn't know as much as was turned up, especially with that. The information that's embedded in that insurance map is just really amazing.
Yeah, they're amazing resources.
Yeah. If you could choose just one thing that is the most interesting to you so far about this project, what would it be?
It would be what I mentioned earlier, which is, for the most part, for over 30 years, I've been working on preservation projects that just work extremely, extremely diligently to preserve as much historic fabric as possible. And if it's missing, to recreate it identically in what we call in kind, same material, same dimensions, same design. And it's very exciting to work on this project where we were allowed under the Secretary of the Interior standards some latitude with this reconstruction to use more modern materials, provided they result in an appearance that is compatible with the historic context and other historic resources around this building. It's been challenging. We've had challenges with windows. We've had challenges with siding, and how do we make sure that these newer materials affect an appearance that is compatible with the historic, very important historic buildings, the Homestead being a National Historic Landmark, that are right nearby. And so it's been really wonderful to work with the contractor and the architect in the museum to solve some of those problems in a way that will result in a really interesting and usable, comfortable new building that looks very, very much like what Emily would have seen.
Yeah, I just think it's so great that the Emily Dickinson Museum has gotten to work with 3 of the 4 treatments that the Secretary's standards outline. Rehabilitation is the only one missing, and who knows? I'll just trail off there. So thank you, Shanti. Before we introduce our next guest, we have another birthday message and this one from award-winning American novelist and author of Practical Magic, Alice Hoffman, who recorded her message from the Dickinson Family Library at the homestead. So perhaps we can get to that message a little bit later. So we'll invite Mark Andrews to join us. He's our next guest, and he's the Senior Capital Projects Manager with Amherst College's Department of Planning, Design, and Construction. And for nearly 20 years, Mark has managed award-winning construction projects for Amherst College, ranging from deeply technically super demanding construction of science labs to high performance historic renovation and reconstruction, not just at the Emily Dickinson Museum, but there are other historic buildings on Amherst College campus. His work includes 10 years in practice with local architecture firms, as well as supervision of UMass architecture experienced students pursuing licensure. So he's got some of their futures in his hands. He's a retired combat veteran with 23 years of service and a graduate of the U.S. Army's Command and General Staff College. So welcome, Mark.
Thanks,
Boy,
Jane.
it's been fun to work with you for, I think, 10 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Been 10 years, Jane. It went by fast.
It has. I know, we just need more projects. But yeah, you've been working with us on major physical plant projects for a while now. And
Right.
for those of you at home, that's because Amherst College is the official owner of the museum and its property. So we are very fortunate to have such wonderful and talented and dedicated assistance from Mark and his colleagues.
Thank you.
Okay, so Emily Dickinson, Amherst College. What makes projects at the museum different from others in your portfolio?
Yeah, there are quite a few differences between the Dickinson and really everywhere else at the college. When I started about 10 years ago, it was a stone foundation repair project at the homestead. And then that turned into various interior preservation systems projects, installation of a couple of missed fire protection systems, the administrative offices at 20 Triangle Street, now the Carriage House. And I think I counted 7 or 8, depending on how you look at it, projects in the last 10 years or so. Um, but in contrast, right now I'm working on the Student Center Dining Commons project. It's a large project where we're trying to enhance the student life here on campus. What we did is we sort of took a big saw and we cut off the top of this big old science building. And now we are building a mass timber structure on top of that, 2 stories on top of an existing concrete foundation. And all that's being done sort of with a strong European flair because we've employed a sort of a European architect with some reputation in that regard. Um, Before that, I have some experience rebuilding or building the Lyceum. That's the home for humanistic inquiry in our Amherst College History Department. This was the college's first mass timber project, and it was the first time we paid attention to zero embodied carbon. That's sort of paying attention to the carbon that goes into building a building and accounting for that. Basically, concrete and steel have a pretty strong negative effect, and we try and use wood products and cellulose insulation and that sort of stuff to offset all that. Um, and then before that, worked on the lab project that Jane had talked about earlier. It's our science center. It's a couple 100,000 square feet. That opened in 2018. And that was something that really merged all the disciplines of science at Amherst College. And I think a quarter of the classes at the college are taught in that facility. So, but massively different than the environment at the Dickinson. Working at the Dickinson is totally unique. And I found it to be a notable part of my job to articulate the uniqueness of the environment to others in the industry because it's not immediately clear. The sacred nature of the homestead and the Evergreens sort of goes without saying, but recognition of the importance of the grounds is sometimes less obvious to those in the broader construction community. So typical construction sort of allows you to modify the grading and the planting and the landscape rather aggressively, as long as you replace it. But the recognition that the grounds are as important as the buildings and that formed Emily's writing, is something that takes some explanation, sort of some processing from people.
Yeah, yeah. As you were talking about those, some of your other projects, there is considerable creativity in lopping off the top of a building and and then putting something else on top of it. So I guess possibly this carriage house project is the closest you've come at the Emily Dickinson Museum to other things that you ordinarily work on. Okay, that's sort of a question, but but I'm
Yes.
going to use the example. The decision to go with passive house construction was relatively easy, but the implementation is maybe not as easy. So I wonder if you could, maybe comment on that, and maybe how passive house, how that fits within a regulatory environment.
Sure. I'll start off by saying Massachusetts is a pretty regulated state relative to most of the other states. And during the pandemic, Massachusetts went through a deliberative process and decided to adopt a new energy code. This was an attempt to sort of address the impact of climate change, the effect new building stock has on climate change. And it's focused largely on 2 things: one, efficiency, obviously, and 2, encouraging electrification for heating. The new code was going to be the law of the land for the carriage house because when it took effect and all other buildings moving forward, this new code laid out, I think, 5 different paths for compliance. But the funny thing, the interesting thing about it is that when you actually laid out all the paths and looked at it, they kind of got you to the same place. They largely they all would have delivered a building that was so well insulated and airtight as to require very limited energy use, even in the harshest of conditions, as well as incentivizing heat pump technology, which is electrification. One of those paths was called Passive House. It came to us from Germany a few years ago, and it initially came over When it was originally designed in Germany, they actually didn't put furnaces or heating elements in the buildings because the buildings were so well heated, just the occupancy use, the refrigerator, that residual heat was enough. Here in Massachusetts, our climate's different than Bavaria. We get humidity, so we needed dehumidification, and we had modified that. That became this thing called PHIUS, Passive House in the US, and that's what Massachusetts adopted. So in the end, we have these systems that do have a heating plant, but work a lot less hard than a conventional building. And so when the dust settled, the museum was in a position to build the first passive house commercial building in the area without really having to do all that much more than any other building would have been required to do at the time. And that was kind of the remarkable intersection of where we were and what was going on in the world.
Yeah, it's just been really exciting and gratifying to be sort of at the head of the curve on this. And we know the curve is going to catch up, catch up with the new regulations. But this is an exciting project. Is that what you think is most interesting about this project? Do you have any other sort of thoughts about things that maybe you didn't expect?
Most interesting about the project. It's the carriage house. It's literally the past and the future of what I do for a living, design and construction in terms of its components. The really special thing is that it's on the most significant historic site in the valley, and it just simply works. It's a bold reconstruction of a structure that helped influence Emily's rating, but at the same time, it's cutting edge in terms of its efficiency, and it's showing the rest of the world the way forward in terms of environmental conservation. It does all that stuff in a fiscally responsible way because we would have had to do most of it anyway. And all the stars really aligned. In the regulatory environment, it changed under our feet, but it didn't tip us over. We embraced it, and I'm proud. I'm inspired. And 194 years later, Emily's still inspiring people.
So I don't think I mentioned at the beginning of this, Emily's interaction with Carriage House. Well, we don't know a lot specifically about her interaction with the Carriage House, but her niece wrote some, biographical material about her. And the one thing she said about the Carriage House was that Emily's brother, Martha's father, Austin, his law office was just, 2 blocks up the street. But for some reason, he he drove his horses in a bug. He drove a buggy with horses from his office back to his house. Okay, 2 blocks. You wonder why. And what Martha describes is that he would sort of careen into the Evergreens driveway, sort of on one wheel, and race the horses up to the carriage house door, so that their noses would just barely touch it. And that was pure entertainment just for Emily's benefit, because she was looking out the window over toward the Evergreens. There. Yeah. Well, thanks, Mark, for that perspective on Carriage House reconstruction. And we are ready with Alice Hoffman's greeting.
Hi, I'm Alice Hoffman, and it is such an honor to be here today in Emily Dickinson's house. I am a huge, huge fan, and without my even asking her to, she continually creeps into my books. When I think about her, I think about someone who created a world that belonged to them and then was shared. And I think that is what every writer's dream is to do. After great pain, a formal feeling comes. The nerves sit ceremonious like tombs. The stiff heart questions, was it he that bore? And yesterday, or centuries before, the feet mechanical go round a wooden way of ground or air or aught, regardless grown, a quartz contentment like a stone. This is the hour of lead, remembered if outlived, as freezing persons recollect the snow. First chill, than stupor, than the letting go.
Thanks to Alice Hoffman for that greeting. It's always wonderful to hear writers reading writers. Our next guest, let's welcome Tim Whitman, who is an architect and project manager at EDM Studio, specializing in renovation and sustainable design. He combines creative problem solving with meticulous attention to detail to deliver designs that maximize value. He played a key role in designing Massachusetts' first certified passive house public facility, a project that demonstrated his expertise in energy efficiency, occupant comfort, and sustainability. He also excels in historically sensitive renovations, blending thorough research with innovative design to preserve a building's character while adapting it for modern use. And so, Tim, you've married all of these things in this project, and I, you know, I, thinking about the sort of the archaeology and the documentary research and that those phases of this project. How do you take something like that? How do you take historic research and turn it into building design, such as in this instance?
It's a process, and it takes many tracks and many ways of interpretation, and it takes a team. Essentially, depending on what you have available to you, it's looking at what evidence do you have and what can you do with it, as well as trying to understand what the underlying reasons were for why the building was the way it was, what were the forces that created it, and then trying to bring that into the future. One of the things that I've tried to do, and an approach that I found fascinating working through historic buildings, which is more or less what we've done in this case by virtue of bringing it into the future with new technologies and sustainability, is to think from the standpoint of if Emily Dickinson were around today and she was looking outside her window and wanted to build the carriage house anew, what would she do? Trying to understand her perspective, her personality, to hold history and current technology in tension. She was brave, she was innovative, she was bold, she was different. So while we want to honor what was in the sense of the foundation, the orientation, the size, which those were all things we could glean from the photos that Shantia shared, we also know that this was a building that's about utility. This was a building that served the land. So how can we do that today? What's the best opportunity we have today to be able to take the best technology today and apply it to that building while honoring the past?
Yeah, it occurs to me that Emily Dickinson's lifetime coincided with a period of tremendous technological change. Um, and, I know Austin was kind of an innovator of sorts. He was one of the first in Amherst to kind of attach to an Italianate style of architecture. He was sort of looking out for the next best thing, and he was involved in all these kinds of public improvements and public works, public utilities. So I think we've got good rationale for what we're doing in this instance, and also just plain being responsible in this changing landscape of energy and climate. What Tim, what do you like about working with historic properties versus, say, new construction in other jobs that you work on?
Well, first and foremost, if we're looking at this from the standpoint of where we are in the world and the desire to be sustainable, the reality is the most sustainable building is the one that's not built, but that's reused. So it's a little bit different situation than we're dealing with here because we're resurrecting a building. But that's one of the nice things is we have so many buildings that remain from history, whether they have historical significance or not. And are they being fully used to their potential? And there's so many buildings where that is possible, where that is a way that we can move forward into the future and provide the necessary real estate, whether it's for residential or for commercial use, with buildings that already exist. And that's something that we should and have a duty to do where it's possible to do. The other piece that's really fascinating when you work with a historic property is as architects, we have to be surgeons. We have to remain truthful to the character of what was there, maintain, sustain, and refurbish what was there, and walk that tightrope between what is there and salvageable and needs to be maintained and needs to be preserved, and then also understanding that, well, this is a modern building. There are certain requirements that need to be met, both from the standpoint of, in this case, energy code is one of the things we're focusing on very much here, or other codes or other regulations or programmatic need that we're trying to do. So there's a lot of balancing that has to happen. And there's a lot of looking at how can we best fit. The way I look at it is that the past enriches the future. We have to take our roots and build off of them, and that's how society can progress.
Yeah. Um, eh, you know, this the passive house nature of this project. Mark's talked a little bit about it, but how is passive house construction applied kind of literally in this project? Like, uh, what's different about, say, insulation, or what's different about
Mhm.
systems?
So
What's an
Mark
idea
gave
of what it
a
means? Yeah.
yeah, Mark gave a brief introduction. It came over from Europe. It's generally a standard of building better, more focused on thermal control, so your envelope, air control in terms of air infiltration, radiation control in terms of how much solar heat you may gain in the building, as well as moisture control. It's very heavily focused on the envelope. One example that I've heard used quite a bit is you could think of it as the example of a thermos and how that functions. With a thermos, you build the envelope well enough, the heat will stay in or the cold will stay in, and the outer environment won't affect it as much. That's the basic concept. The idea is you're improving the envelope enough that then the systems that you put in place in the building, whether to heat or cool, can be reduced by a proportionate amount. So the example you brought up, Jane, in terms of the insulation, and this is where choosing passive house, even though energy codes were moving towards a much more stringent position, passive house is even that much more than the energy codes as they are now, because we are 130% more insulation in the roof than what code requires in the building we're constructing right now. And we are also 130% more insulation in the walls. Same thing also holds true for our windows. Our windows perform 160% greater than what the code, energy code, base energy code, calls for right now. All of the things that we're doing in the carriage house under construction today are about making that building as tight as it possibly can be so that then the heating and cooling systems that are in it are as efficient and as small and right sized as they can be. As Mark brought up, and I've heard the other example as well of if you build a 10 by 10-foot room to passive house standard, you could heat it with an incandescent light bulb.
That is a remarkable analogy. Like, wow, yeah. Um, So, okay, so then that raises a question. So what outcomes can we specifically, or yeah, what outcomes can the museum expect from this project?
Well, as you've mentioned, as many of us on this panel have mentioned, this recreates more of the existing site as was here and brings it a lot of that historical nature back. It also reestablishes elements that, as you brought up the story with Austin, brings up more of the history of what Emily saw and wrote about. Um, but it also creates this entry and welcome center, which is an example for the community. As a highly environmentally conscious building, this then becomes an example both for the community as well as an opportunity to educate as to what's possible.
Well, thank you, Tim. That's what we'll look for as our outcomes when this project wraps up. It'll be in the spring, this coming spring, 2025. Well, this is such an interesting conversation with all of you, and we're going to bring all of us back together in a few minutes. But before that, we would like to share a final birthday message from Ada Limon. She is the 24th Poet Laureate of the United States and the first Latina to hold that distinction. So here is our message from Ada.
Hi, my name is Ada Limon, and I'm wishing Emily Dickinson a wonderful birthday. She's one of my all-time favorite poets. I think of her quite often. I hold a lot of her lines and images in my heart. The poem I think of the most is probably this one. Not knowing when the dawn will come, I open every door. Or has it feathers like a bird, or billows like a shore? Happy birthday, Emily. You're still with us.
Yeah, that's wonderful. We just so appreciate all of these artists and writers sharing their greetings with us on this special day. We will be going to a little discussion and Q&A in just a moment. So I see there are some questions populating our Q&A already. So go ahead and add your questions for any of our guests. And before I bring us all back, let's take a look at how the Carriage House has progressed from its August groundbreaking through to this week. Well, you know, it's just it seems like has looked different every day. The construction, the progress has been remarkable. So it's really quite inspiring to see this happening just across the lawn from the homestead. Well, we have some questions coming up in our Q&A, and there are several about first off with archaeology. So Anna, there are a couple of things for you. Wondering when you began your work, and were you sort of you were kind of running alongside the machinery, or did you stop them, and how did that communication process go? And there's a question about technique. Were you sifting? Were you just pulling things out? I wonder if you could comment on method.
Sure thing. Oh, thank you. So the archaeological monitoring project was taking place just before Labor Day. So we were on site for almost 4 days, taking part in the preliminary excavation of the footprint of the carriage house. And to that end, we were in our hard hats and steel-toed boots, sort of a safe distance, trying to maintain some safety protocols there, coordinating with the excavators and the heavy machinery operators, and working in concert with them as they would use the machinery to pull back materials, overburden of soil or vegetation. We were there to really take a look as closely as possible at any of the deposits that caught our eye. So we worked out a little scenario where we would stop the equipment operators and approach the site, approach the deposits safely and carefully to look at other objects. So in terms of technique, this archaeological monitoring process does not involve a sifting routine ordinarily. This time we did not have any of that traditional, as I said, trowel and brush, or in this case, sifting operation taking place. We were identifying objects in the ground and removing them. And what went back to the lab, as a matter of fact, was only a small portion of what was there on site. We collected and returned to the Amherst laboratory. My office is just down the road. We returned to the laboratory about 110 different objects of a variety of materials. So those were cleaned and processed off-site of the excavation. But indeed, the typical kind of archaeological work that you imagine from television specials, that does take place. It has taken place with other projects that have occurred at the museum. And both of those kinds of techniques, the monitoring technique and the formal excavation technique, they work in concert to really address the preservation and interpretation goals that the museum has set forth for itself.
Thanks so much. I know there's some curiosity about why stuff was in the carriage house. The why particular kinds of objects and so forth. And I think I can offer just a little bit of a timeline for that carriage house to maybe help with this just a bit. So at the Evergreen site, there was a small kind of vernacular New England cottage before the Italianate portion of the house was built. So that cottage seems to date to the 1840s. And we just really don't know whether the carriage house was an outbuilding for that cottage or whether it was constructed after the Italianate piece. The main part of the house was built in 1856. However, we know, it served as a carriage house for a while. When Martha Dickinson Bianchi was married to a man who was involved in the sale of electric cars in the before 1910. It was probably a little bit of a garage at that point. And then at the point of that Sanborn fire insurance map in 1910, it was labeled as storage. So at that point, Martha Dickinson Bianchi may have just been sort of putting stuff in there that, they had nowhere else to keep it. She died in 1943. The carriage house stood in place until it either fell down or was torn down in the early 1950s. So some things were removed, but apparently they just didn't take everything. And it doesn't, I don't think we can tell from the objects recovered whether there was any, any sort of useful objects in there.
Well, there are a few whole objects, or what seemed to be whole at one point. It may be the burial or later disruption and ground disturbance may have damaged them. But the artifacts themselves come from about 1830 to, just looking at my notes, about 1830, 1840 to about 1930. So about 90 years of object date ranges. Certainly a building that was standing for a great deal of time, close to 100 years, has the opportunity to collect stuff. People tend to discard objects, not either purposefully or we will do it being very unaware. Living here in Massachusetts, I'm in the greater Boston area, and my own backyard has a collection of a little bit of an archaeological midden of its own, trash that was deposited in the 1930s and 1940s before trash hauling services became a part of the American lifestyle. So we are not surprised as archaeologists to find objects discarded, disposed of in places that are no longer used. They tend to be receptacles for things that are no longer wanted, not in fashion, or in some way broken. Most of the objects were definitely fragmentary. There was one bottle that is now back at the museum that had a sealed lid on it with an unknown liquid inside, something that we tried to take care for very, very specially. So there were some objects there that were whole. One of the interesting things that we did not find, while we did see domestic refuse, we didn't see a lot of kitchen refuse. We didn't see food scraps. We saw a very limited amount of bone inside of the deposits that were there. A little bit of butchered bone that might have come from a meal or discarded kitchen scraps. So this looks to be really that sort of refuse of the house coming into what was the collapsing or soon to be collapsed building in the mid 20th century.
Well, thank you. It's Shanti, there's a question about, how do you choose colors or materials when nothing exists any longer? How do we go about that? Or how does one go about that on a reconstruction project?
Well, so one of the things that one would do if materials and colors aren't known is, for a specific reconstruction, is to widen your knowledge by what your local community, where the reconstruction's occurring, still has standing. What's extant? What was the typical siding of outbuildings in Amherst, in Northampton, in Massachusetts? And that's how we arrived for the Carriage House at very likely it was vertical board siding. We also checked period references, including A.J. Downing's Architecture of Country Houses, to look at what he suggested for stables in the mid 19th century. So in terms of color, it's a little more challenging. But again, we sort of, extrapolate what's a typical approach. What was the typical approach? The interesting thing about this building, because we were using new materials, was, okay, we're not going to use wood board siding, vertical siding. We're going to use a new material called boral that looks like wood, has a wood grain. One of the clever things that had to be worked out by the contractor was how to make it really read as if it's historic wood. In other words, the grain gets randomized so that it looks, like historic wood. So there've been a number of challenges. With the roof, we simply replicated the standing seam metal roof that is a known feature of the Evergreens. Was that the roof on the carriage house? It could have been, it may have been, it may not have been, but it's not, it's a perfectly compatible choice.
Well,
No,
and just to add briefly to that, one of the pieces that we worked with Shanti on was to see what extant carriage houses or barns are there in New England, and that we could use as a reference point. And one of the common trends we saw is that very often they were the miniature version of the home they were associated with.
Right. And I
yeah,
think,
that's
Jane,
right now. Go ahead, Shanti.
the
Sorry.
one thing I would add is, I think the question was about roof and colors. I would say our most challenging issue with this passive house, which won't surprise anybody who knows historic preservation, were how to deal with windows. Because your typical double hung sash, operable window, one or two operable sash, was not going to fly. It was not going to be passive house. And we landed upon a rather ingenious solution, which is we have plate glass as the actual window, and over the plate glass reproduction of the historic storm windows on the Evergreens. So the appearance from the exterior of the building will be as if a wooden storm window is there. And it really did solve the problem, but that took months and months and months to hash out.
I think, Tim, I remember you saying that windows were that's been the sort of the toughest bit of processing we've had to do.
Well, and with Passive House, the biggest issue or the biggest hurdle you're ever going to deal with is anytime you penetrate the envelope. And it's when you think about anything of that nature, your weak points are what? Your doors, your windows, a vent, or a pipe penetration, or anything of that nature. Anytime you're passing through that, because we have that increased level of insulation, well, you don't get that level with a window or with a door. And so we can get close, we can seal it up as tight as possible, but also part of that is looking at the building and how can we limit those penetrations both in their size and their number.
Well, it is a wonderful project, and at this point, we've been through quite a variety of projects and have managed to light on a brand new thing. So I want to let you all know the Carriage House will be open in the spring, and we'll keep you posted through our e-newsletter, our website, and social media about that opening. I want to thank our 4 guests who have contributed so much already to the success of this project. Suanna Crowley and SWCA Environmental Consultants, Shandi Anderhagen and Preservation Strategies, Mark Andrews and Amherst College, Tim Widman and EDM Studios. So coming up in just a few minutes at 7:30, our friends at the Folger Shakespeare Library will be holding their annual Emily Dickinson birthday tribute featuring the wonderful poet Kimiko Han. I'm looking forward to that program and I hope you'll enjoy it also. So just finally, thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. This is our last program in calendar year 2024. All of us at the Emily Dickinson Museum are just so grateful to you and to everyone who's participated in these programs in person and online throughout the year, and those who've come to visit the Dickinson homes. We just take such joy in sharing what we know of Emily Dickinson's life and poetry, and in hosting some of the poets she inspires every day today. Of course, this wouldn't be possible without your generous support. So please take a moment to contribute to this work at the link you'll see in the chat. Who knows? Yours may be the 194th gift to complete the the birthday challenge. So thank you again. We'll see you early in 2025. Good night to